Welcome to Infocom. I am Tigran Grigoryan, and today our guest is Adam Przeworski, an emeritus professor of politics at New York University, who is widely regarded as one of the leading authorities on democracy. Professor Przeworski, we're truly honored to have you as a guest, and naturally today we will talk about democracy and the challenges facing democracy globally, but also in different parts of the world. So I'll start this conversation with a question about your famous definition of democracy. So you famously define democracies as systems where incumbents lose elections. Armenia is an emerging democracy. One might argue that it started the democratic transition in 2018 with the Velvet Revolution and is in this process of transition and probably democratic consolidation. So what are the prerequisite conditions for these newly emerging democracies to have the arrangement where the incumbents are comfortable enough to lose elections?
Well, there's a long line of research on this topic, which basically boils down to two factors. One is countries' wealth or per capita income. One of the most striking findings about durability of democracy, as I defined it, is that it never breaks down in countries that have sufficiently high per capita income. And the other aspect is learning, and that is that once a country experiences a few changes in office resulting from elections, then everybody learns that they can lose now and come back in the future, so not that much is at stake. These are really the two fundamental things that we know. Different people introduce additional factors, but they don't matter very much. This is really well established.
Yeah, so coming to your second point about learning and about political actors being sure that they will be treated fairly in the future, I have a question about dealing with the past, because this system where democratic transitions are happening always or normally have very difficult past with corrupt politicians, people who maybe usurped power in the past. And the dilemma is always between choosing justice over prospects for democratic consolidation or vice versa. So given your experience in this field and your academic work, what is the right choice? Should the society choose justice, meaning like trying to hold people accountable who in the past committed certain crimes or were corrupt politicians, or we should just nullify history and start from point zero?
Well, this is a complex issue, which was recently put on the agenda again by the conviction of President Bolsonaro in Brazil. And it's a complex issue for two reasons. That, on the one hand, punishing chief executives who have committed all kinds of crimes or transgressions in the past gives a lesson to all the future chief executives that unless they obey some norms and laws, they would be punished. On the other hand, if they know that, they will adhere to power by any means. They will think that losing power exposes them to danger, and therefore they will do everything possible, legal and illegal, to stay in power. So this has its pros and it has cons. The worst possible situation, I think, is the one that occurred in the United States, namely that a president comes to power, he loses an election, he's being prosecuted, the prosecution doesn't result in anything, and he comes back to power. That, I think, is the worst possible situation.
Yeah, so the other question I wanted to ask is about the role of polarization in all of that. You mentioned the United States, where the society has gotten more and more polarized, and probably the things you've just described are also an outcome of this polarization when you basically see the political field in very black and white lenses. We have a similar situation here in Armenia, especially after the country's defeat in the Second Karabakh War, which was like a key moment in the modern history of the country. And the political discourse is very polarized. So there is not much content in political discussions. The opposition blames the government of being a sellout, and the government blames the opposition of being foreign agents and stuff like that. And it leaves very little space for content-based political discourse in the country. What are the ways of overcoming this situation and arriving at this arrangement of incumbents losing elections and not facing dire consequences?
Polarization is something which I think we still don't quite understand. And we still don't quite understand because there are big controversies whether politicians generate it or whether politicians reflect it. What is the cause and what is the effect? But more generally, I am somewhat skeptical about polarization as a threat to democracy. The phenomenon is undeniable, and it's worldwide. It's true in Armenia, it's true in the United States, it's true in most of Western Europe, it's true in most of Latin America. But democracy is not threatened in many of these countries. It's threatened in the United States, but it's not threatened in Western Europe. So what is the role of polarization is not that easy to define. I think what does matter is that both the party in power and the opposition believe that not too much is at stake in the results of elections. That if they believe that if some government wins an election, is going to introduce changes which are going to deeply affect the way people live, both socially, economically, and culturally. And if they believe that if a government comes to power, it will deny the opposition a chance to win, then stakes are enormous, and then you get conflict. But as long as people, even if they are polarized, as long as they expect that the incoming government is not going to shake things too much and that they will have their chance in the future, I think democracy survives.
Unfortunately, I'm not sure whether that's the case with Armenia, because both the government and the opposition use very aggressive rhetoric about each other and also use certain threats. But I would like to focus on the more global processes. I've been listening to one of your latest speeches or lectures, and you were questioning the trend of democratic backsliding globally. You were saying, yes, of course, there are countries where certain negative changes are happening, but democracy is overall okay globally. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
One of the things which I think people misled about is the distinction between the electoral progress or even electoral victories of parties we don't like, say in Western Europe, the extreme right, and the threats to democracy. One of the things that strikes me is that in Western Europe, in Sweden, Austria, Italy, parties with openly fascist roots, parties which are xenophobic, racist, want to be repressive, either come to power as parts of coalitions or in Italy are dominant in the coalition. They implement some of their policies, but they don't undermine democracy. They don't take steps that violate basic democratic norms. In Argentina, President Milei, who wants to effectuate a revolution in the relationship between the state and society, the role of the state in the society, as profound as President Trump. He lost an election, partial election, and he said, well, we lost an election, we're going to learn from it, we're going to win the next one. He actually won the next one. So I think that the reason I don't think there is a generalized crisis of democracy is precisely that, namely that, yes, parties I don't like win elections, but they don't threaten democracy while there, and they're going to lose.
Yeah, so in your 2018 book called Why Bother with Elections, you're trying to explain to the reader why democracy is probably the most efficient of the less efficient regimes that exist there. And you come to the conclusion, the main conclusion of the book is that the main function of democracy is overcoming political disagreements, political conflict through peaceful means. We've had this situation in our country, coming back to Armenia, right after the war. There was a real threat of civil strife, you would say. And the fact that it was solved through democratic elections proves your theory right. But years after that election, we're hearing a lot of conversations, a lot of views about elections being not just a domestic process. The role of external interference, hybrid threats, is a very hot topic now in this part of the world. So do you think the countries should come up with some sort of new toolkit of protecting this domestic process of overcoming conflicts through peaceful means that could protect the electoral processes from external pressures and external interventions? And what should these tools be?
I don't know. The question of foreign intervention, interference in the conduct of elections, that varies from country to country, is often very obscure because it's often deliberately hidden. The role of Russians in Western European elections, for example, is hotly debated. In France, for example, there were kind of anti-Semitic signs painted on some buildings, and it turned out that it was some Bulgarians who were hired by the Russians. So, this is not so easy to touch. Obviously, protection from foreign interference is extraordinarily important, and to some extent, it's the role of intelligence and counterintelligence agencies, if they themselves are not penetrated, to defend the country from it. But otherwise, I really believe that democracy survives if the losers are willing to accept their defeat, which they think is temporary, and the winners allow the opposition to win, which means that they treat their victory as temporary. And on this, Samuel Huntington had this rule of two alternations.
Yeah.
That if you have twice going back and forth change in office, then democracy is there to stay. I did some empirical research on it. It turns out that the magic number is as much as 4. But there's only one country which needed 4, which was Chile. Otherwise, 2 is a pretty good rule. So, there's a party who wins an election. That party loses an election. The new party loses an election. And then everybody learns. They just learn, well, we may have terrible conflict. We may be terribly polarized. And yet, we have a chance. So that, I think, is truly crucial. Now, whether that occurs, in many countries it doesn't. In many countries, some party wins an election and then it's not willing to lose, and civil strife in all kinds of forms ensues. So there is no guarantee in it.
Yeah, and probably my last question is about different systems. Which systems are more prone to arriving at that arrangement, parliamentary or presidential? Because I guess in parliamentary systems, there is no this zero-sum game situation, and probably people are more willing to accept the outcome of the election.
I've done some systematic research on it. It's a very controversial issue because you probably know there was a famous political scientist, Juan Linz, who thought that democracy is less stable in presidential systems. But my research concludes that it's not true. That the fact that democracies, as we observe them, are less stable in presidential systems is mainly due to the fact that these systems often inherit situations of military intervention. It's not due to the system itself. And if you look at the cases of what we call backsliding, undermining democracy around the world today, you find in presidential systems and you find in parliamentary systems. Turkey was first a parliamentary system. Hungary is a parliamentary system. India is a parliamentary system. And then there are several in which democracy is undermined in presidential system. Venezuela, perhaps now the United States. I don't really think it matters. Presidents have more power typically than prime ministers, but when they lose election, they have to govern with an opposition in the parliament, and typically they make arrangements.
Yeah, I like to say that in our case, Armenia is a parliamentary republic. The prime minister probably has more powers than any previous president has ever had, because we made the transition to the parliamentary system in 2015. So when the prime minister has a majority in the parliament, he basically has all the powers in the country. But probably we'll stop here. Professor Przeworski, thanks a lot for this conversation, and I wish you good luck.
I very much appreciate it. Thank you.